open band.
So I'm going to take advantage of Anders and Robin's work, and I'm going to say absolutely nothing about what whole brain emulation is. We'll say a bit about why it's worth talking about. So there are arguments that whole brain emulation is sort of an odd duck in the history of technology. We've got airplanes, not ornithopters. And there are other kinds of ways in which knowledge of biology could inform AGI. So you could have something that was inspired, but not closely mimicking whole brain emulation. There was a survey at last year's edition of this conference. Very small n, serious selection biases. So I wouldn't necessarily say that this is the most likely or default scenario, but certainly it's possible. It's worth considering, and as Robin said, it's easier to analyze in some ways, and a lot of it we might be able to generalize from. And I'm going to have a little bit of a different focus. So Robin was looking at the inside view from whole brain emulation operating within these server farms, these data centers. But you can also look at it from the outside. And they wind up very different. So if we take Robin's figure of at full tilt growth, doubling time every 2.3 weeks, then if you have a long-term trend, 20 doublings of GDP, less than a year, 10 calendar years in, perhaps millions of subjective years for the fastest M's, who are the ones who are advancing science and technology, acting as leaders. So you wind up that from a human perspective, while the M era may be big from the perspective of the M's, it's actually a very brief interlude before something else from the human perspective. And over the history of the Earth, almost all of the future will be after this period of a couple of years. And this talk is focused, again, more on the control problem that Nick was talking about, Nick Bostrom. And just to sort of dramatize the difficulties, humans eclipse. So consider a country, United Kingdom, trying to exert effective control over a territory where you can't send your government officials. Time runs vastly faster. There are many new technologies that the folk within this territory have had centuries to adapt to and understand. And you maybe have got the Wikipedia downloaded to you, and you're trying to make sense of it and catch up with hundreds of years of technological advance, political change, and figure out, so now what do I do? Knowing that my actions will take years of subjective time to be transmitted. And of course, if GDP is so large in these centers, the historical correlation is that military power goes tightly with GDP. So it would be a surprising break in the history of governance if it was easy for existing governments to maintain authority over regions within their borders that were participating in this economy. So pretty difficult. If you were going to do it, it would seem you would have to have proxies who were operating at these speeds and these environments. Maybe you don't trust any human in the world to maintain over subjective centuries that kind of loyalty. And you might have further problems with the early whole brain emulations. They might not be exactly the ones you would want. The reconstruction might cause amnesia, change of personalities. But perhaps you could enhance them to a level of trust where even such an extreme task would be within reach. So we cover three main topics here. First, this question of going forward towards a whole brain emulation transition. What are the opportunities to steer things by way of initial conditions? How could those conditions affect the long-term future? And this is from an impartial point of view. Second is a question that hasn't been addressed very much so far in the literature. which is what actually happens to the unuploaded humans. And this may be just that people who are worried about future generations and M's maybe have a lot more reason to think about these considerations. I see the audience here is mostly human, so there may be some interest in that. And last, I'll talk about the control problem for whole brain emulations and what would be the most off-the-shelf versions that might allow humans to actually hope to steer such a transition and see what we can do to assess that feasibility. So let's start. The natural question, why not leave it to the M's? The M's are people too. It is disputed, but I would go with the assumption Anders was making. These are moral agents, moral patients. When I talked last year, they're smarter. They have a lot of advantages in figuring out the answers to problems. And it would be silly to imagine a Neanderthal trying to shape things in our civilization today. Long dead, hard to influence, and they have no stable interventions move over time. For whole brain emulation, I think it's a bit different because we have, if this happens, we have direct knowledge because we were able to actually design them. We're contemporaneous, and the technology itself opens up new ways to implement lasting interventions. And so, yeah, and what might we want that they wouldn't pursue or wouldn't be able to? So these competitive pressures, evolutionary pressures that they might not endorse, but I'm going to focus more in this section on the first mover opportunities and the possibility to set up institutions. And especially the idea of a singleton solving global coordination problems. Robin was showing these graphs of the talk circles. And as those shrink, it becomes harder to coordinate over larger scales. And there's an initial opportunity as the first whole brain emulations are introduced to have this leap forward, have the first brain emulations in a single jurisdiction or in a single institutional framework. And why might you want that? So a lot of these things tie into the speed. So we have nuclear weapons, thousands of them. Every so often, there's an international confrontation, Cuban Missile Crisis, Able Archer, flare-up that happened in Taiwan, but we sort of accept it. Politicians have to decide, am I going to go to enormous extremes, make big political sacrifices to avoid little risk? And so they accept some risk. And that's okay over a short time, but over a long time, not so good. And there are other factors that recur occasionally in history. You get big ideological changes, you have variation in leaders, you have lone individuals, terrorism, and you have new technologies that are discovered. And each of these brings some risk over a long history. Many people might die or suffer out of these things, but perhaps at any given time the damage would not be so large. But if you accelerate all this process by thousands of times, then a human who's around for the whole brain emulation transition is also around to see any disasters of this type that lie ahead in the next 10,000, 100,000 subjective years. And so if that's not going to happen, then either you have some kind of stable institutions that make this M world much less prone to war, disturbance, violent turbulence than our history has been so far, or there's some spontaneous natural fall and risk levels change in technology. And so if that's the case, then we might help to create that kind of stability. And stable institutions are very easy and would naturally merge or be set up by the M's themselves, then we might try to change their character. I'm just going to skip over this slide. This is just the question of can you just move away from any turbulence, get to the periphery. We can get to the periphery maybe for a while, but again, if this whole transition and million-fold economic growth is happening over a year or two, then okay, you can escape for a little while, but a 1-year reprieve is not that great. Nick Bostrom, again, has written on some of these competitive pressures that you might want coordination to avoid. Just there are things that we like, so play, romantic love, watching TV, that we might have fewer opportunities for as we substitute towards work, optimal efficiency, and lots of resources spent on long-term competitive activities that might have been avoided. So, but that's been pretty well covered in the past. And there's Robin made the assumption that we have a world where whole brain emulation stays the same. We have no novel minds, no merging, no splitting, but there's a bit of tension with the very high speeds. So if you have the top of the pyramid, so a 16 million times speed up, then this is even if you have a fairly conservative estimate for AGI timelines, which I think is pretty fair, because as you go to the groups that are less selected for being AGI enthusiasts, you get further and further timelines. So probably it should be pretty conservative for human progress towards AGI. But even if it's hundreds of years, well, with very high speed up, 100-fold speed up, 1 year from 100, 1,000-fold speed up, 1.2 months, 53 minutes. If you have the 16 million times speed up at the top of the pyramid, then I mean it's shorter than our Q&A. So, and now the actual speed up you get wouldn't be quite as fast as the emulations themselves, because there are other inputs that go into AI research. If you're using effectively a Pentium 480 Pentium Intel computer, and you've just moved back from the computers of 30 years hence, you're going to have trouble. You're going to have to optimize your code very finely. You're going to be using the blackboard a lot more. But nonetheless, to the extent that AI research is about ideas and algorithms and not just brute force, then you expect big shifts there. And if you have, again, the movement towards AGI and novel forms of mind among whole brain emulations, then you have race to the front, presumably by the fastest emulations. This is just a chart of the delays between the front runner and the runner-up for nuclear weapons and delivery technologies. And this is just for the first atomic bomb. And so, a nice thing about whole brain emulations, if you had initially a singleton, or that is, if you have a lead of, say, a year or two, or even 6 months of those with the cutting edge brain emulation technology, either the originals or a more efficient implementation, then their effective lead gets amplified. If you're 6 months ahead, but you're going 20 times as fast, then you have a chance to do 10 years of research. And the longer the lead you have, fewer risks you take. So this is these are some of the ways in which, by shaping what the institution's first whole brain emulations are under, we get to perhaps push on some of these dynamics. And so that's all from an impartial point of view. Weights, distant future generations, whole brain emulations, novel AGIs, all equally. This would be the sort of the utilitarian universalist kind of perspective. There's also just this sort of narrow question of what do the humans do, and who are not uploaded. And again, it's maybe of some interest to humans from a theoretical perspective and in terms of what actually happens, because presumably a lot of the decisions in the development and deployments and sale or prohibition of the technology are going to be made by humans. And just some of these effects on humanity could be sort of the question of survival. Are humans affected by wars, ideological violence, other spillovers from the whole brain emulation economy or its successors? What happens to human wealth? Is it actually profitable for humans to try and sell and unleash this technology into the world? And so on this area of turbulence, so you don't want to get too much into the weeds. The main argument is just that we witness a lot of violence and disturbance over history, and over an extremely long subjective period, we have to expect more risk of that than a very short one. But just to raise a couple of particular risk factors specific to whole brain emulations that might lead to an ideology which is not necessarily anti-human, but not pro-human. So people have huge life support costs. If you have one whole brain emulation, and computation is effective and efficient, then you can maybe support thousands, millions of digital minds. And the rallying cry is, look, here are these millions of poor M's who are about to be deleted. If we just diverted resources from these human retirees, then these millions of people could get to live out their lives. What kind of moral monster would take this attitude? And so to some degree, this could implement Robert Nozick's idea of a utility monster. And the utility monster is a creature that, when it eats a human, is so happy, it really loves the taste of people, that the benefit to it outweighs the harm to the person eating it, which is something that's not normally realized. But with such a large difference in cost of living, you could approximate this. And so welfare and GDP go up every time a human gets eaten, at least in the direct effect. Fate of the horse. And this would be the argument. So with the treatment of death, which Anders and Robin both went into a lot, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but you have all of these pressures to allow the continual destruction of huge numbers of these creatures. Great economic value of that tends to promote ideology that biological death, not much of a problem. So why should we worry so much if the human population is either destroyed or uploaded against their will? Whereas many humans disagree, may not like that. There's the general reasons why you want to do that. Robin had 42 hours of sleep on his weekly schedule for whole brain emulation. And you do that. You might do that if you want to have a continued activity over time, because you need the sleep to replenish mental processes, reorganize memory. But if you're doing short tasks like the plumber, then just be eliminated. And Anders, at the end of his talk, was discussing human whole brain emulation, social distance. A couple of factors. One is that we're way behind the trend. So if we consider, there was a discussion earlier, what if the ethics of the Romans had been introduced? And keeping slaves, gladiatorial games, all of these heinous things. They'd be very socially unpopular. They would not get invited to the right parties. They would not advance in society. And if you're hundreds or thousands of years behind the cutting edge of the fast minds in the core, then it'll be very hard for you to have the right in-group signals, because those fads continuously change. And you won't be able to, while whole brain emulation can be sped up temporarily to match the fastest, a human can't. So again, it cuts you out of gossip networks, the informal channels of social bonding and allegiance in politics. And just very different lives, very different situation. So that would be the sort of ideological issue. And one reason to think this is especially important in terms of wealth, the role of resources. So this is oil extraction in Saudi Arabia. So many factors of production: labor, capital, land, resources. Resources are not that big today, has a share of GDP. And they don't necessarily become a huge share of GDP going forward, even as wages go down to subsistence. But what they become increasingly is a source of rents, of disposable income. So masses of Malthusian laborers may be earning a large total income, but they have very little disposable income to purchase luxuries, things that one might want. And insofar as humans are inefficient, they're not productive, they're way behind the frontier, sustaining the lives of humans and the entertainments they might want, the descendants they might want to produce, all of that depends on disposable income. And most of those resources are not privately held at the moment. So, got the sun, only a billionth of the solar energy actually lands on the land surface of the Earth. The rest is going to space, the oceans, Antarctica is not part of national territories, and beyond that there's galactic resources, but I'll try and confine to a sort of solar scale for the moment, but a very, very large majority of resource wealth is unclaimed right now. And unclaimed resource wealth tends to be assigned by the political process. And the political process goes with power, it goes with connectedness, it goes with numbers. Now, if you have property rights, either ownership of part of the economy, bonds, resources, you may be able to have a very nice retirement if property rights are enforced, even if it's a small amount relative to the overall GDP. But again, the speed up matters, because you have to not just retain property rights over 100 years or 1,000 years of subjective time in order to manage a few calendar years of possession. You have to be able to deal with millions of years of change. So going back before modern man, or modern humanity. And there are various ways in which wealth tends to be eroded by the broader society. So with property taxes, the property taxes are set at a efficient level. They tend to drive land to the GDP maximizing use, which is in people. Wealth taxes, expropriation, inflation, all more popular against groups that are politically weak. Otherwise, and as Robin says, if the total human wealth is very small, then there's less in the way of spoils to be shared. But on the other hand, there's less political clout to defend against random noise. Like as regulations and policies change for other reasons and then incidentally affect humanity, or it becomes just a moral issue for sort of ideological reasons before. Now, so I've been highlighting some of the maybe neglected negative features there, but decisions might not be made by some democratic vote of the people of the earth or the most powerful governments alike. But if individual corporations are in a position to decide, will we create whole brain emulations? Will we unleash them into the world? And then see this economy, we get a lot of profits right away, depending on how much we're able to appropriate out of their later production. And so is that a good deal for Microsoft shareholders? So mostly share ownership is pretty diversified. Microsoft is held by thousands of institutions, millions of people, and indeed has a share of the world population, which is relevant for the political process. You're getting above 0.1% there. You start selling nuclear controlled brain emulations, some downside risk of getting knocked out by turbulence from the fast center. And you have to divide the profits among your many shareholders. So on a pure wealth basis, if the human share of GDP going forward is going to be much less than 1 in 1,000, it might be actually a bad deal in expected value for Microsoft shareholders to be the ones to sell whole brain emulation to the open market. If you adjust for risk on the downside, it might be more extreme. Although if you're Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg have voting control of the whole company, then maybe decides, well, just go ahead, social media, next level. But broader picture here is that significant risk, apparently, of human elites losing power. If you make that concrete, in an inclusive democracy, almost all the voters very quickly are M's. The only candidates for office who can actually follow what's going on in society are M's. And so existing human officials, human governors, are not in a position to compete. An authoritarian regime, it's that problem from the beginning of can you have little territories within your jurisdiction that have almost all the military power are operating super speed and just cut them out entirely from governance and tricky. So to the extent this is happening, you have the Politburo is considering, so some companies are working on whole brain emulation, and they're just going to publish it open source. And do we want that, given that we expect that we're going to be out of power relatively soon? Human electorates are going to lose their current position, and generally in relative terms, big losses, with some risk of absolute losses. So it seems like there'd be a significant incentive for decision makers looking forward. If there is any way in which they can stabilize this transition, have more control over it, be pretty motivated to find a way. And which brings us to the control problem. And so Nick gave a whole panoply of different methods under capability control. These are just some of the ones that are relevant. Resetting, very important. Automated surveillance. And so Robin was discussing if you have mind reading and direct psychological alteration, there's potential to create superhuman levels of loyalty and loyalty to arbitrary things. And that we have some instinctual drives, reactions to food and sex and heat and cold, but no one is born with a deep instinctual attraction to the Unitarian Church or the government of Liechtenstein. But if you have the ability to observe neural reactions to different stimuli, set up programs to react to that and stimulate the appropriate regions, then you can have such reactions attached to arbitrary stimuli and perhaps get a degree of stability which is very high, and then have those stable emulations implement some procedures that bind their own successors. But how would you get there? Again, there's this competitive pressure. Depending on the lag time, if developing those more thorough means takes years, then it's very difficult to coordinate around the world. All the corporations, academics, governments that can do things. So maybe that doesn't happen, and we push to the competitive scenario pretty quickly. But again, perhaps even if whole brain emulations are not being unleashed to do their thing unencumbered, maybe there's some intermediate speed up you can get. That is, if humans would take years to develop some safety measures, maybe 10 years, which is too much for them to manage, and the actual lead time that they have, could you make use of the untrusted system that you have at the start, using just the crudest methods in order to find your successors? And some of the easiest methods would be you have your human team, you have brain emulations, which are limited in their speed and numbers, and doing compartmentalized tasks, basically generating a 1 million month. And then this can be called and used for various purposes. Again, yeah, ethical issues, very, very serious. But I'm running out of time, so bye-bye ethics. This is the mechanical Turk, human-based computing. There are a lot of techniques for integrating the ability to call on humans easily and rapidly. Kind of tasks you could put it to. Anything that can be put into a formal proof verification system is good. And it takes a long time to make a proof, longer to formalize it. But you can hand off the work of formalizing it to the whole brain emulations. And then all you need to trust is your formally proven proof verifier. This helps for maybe some things, math, some algorithms, some crypto. but not everything. Complex software, it's often easier to build your own based on the algorithms and ideas than to exhaustively be sure that there are no backdoors, no trojans, no problems. And just in developing the direct whole brain emulation control methods, models for the more efficient whole brain emulation, mind reading, psychological alteration, you have now your masses of experimental subjects potentially that others did not have. Very helpful. And just miscellaneous research tasks. So it would not be surprising if you can get a tenfold speed up out of these sorts of things and leverage any initial lag in the development of technology. Now, caveat, if hardware is the strongest limitation, then maybe you have less of a speed up initially, changes some of these scenarios, and also the level of paranoia in the multiple compartments von Neumann-Month API may be great overkill, but it shows how far you might be able to go, even with quite severe restrictions on the capabilities of any clump, any team. And so the slides are not up, but the paper will be following. And so thanks everyone, and some questions.
Thanks. Before we get to the questions, St. Anne has said that people who are checking out today need to have already checked out. So if you are checking out today, can you just go and check out relatively quickly? There's a place you can leave your stuff at the Porter's Lodge in the meantime. Right. Questions? Jan.
Any microphone?
You don't.
So you compare. So you compared the societal progress within Whole Brain Emulation world to the actual progress that we have had over like, thousands of years. How much do you think the comparison would actually have to be slowed down, or would be like sublinear for two reasons? One is that the lack of access to physical experiments that are like on the same speed scale, and the other is the lack of progression of generations. Basically, you have same people around for a million years.
Yeah, so two chunks of that with the generations. If that's a big issue, and you have the kind of robust brain emulation technology we're talking about, presumably people will eventually figure out how to create artificial babies or scan more. On progress, yeah, it seems you would get a very different profile of technological advance. So if we arrange the fields by the extent to which they are brain and chalkboard scientific literature versus Fermilab, huge, complicated equipment that takes years of physical construction, rare elements, etc. You're going to get a huge skew of progress towards the former end. There'll be lots of advances in mathematics, lots of advances in pure algorithms, fewer in brute force optimization of parameters, way less. You may have a lot of theoretical physics advances, but then be unable to test which theories are right. Likewise with working with chemistry, some kinds of engineering, biotechnology. All of those will be much slower. But if we're looking at the areas that would seem to have the most promise to keep going, the areas that progress would be skewed towards, those areas of mathematics, computer science, cryptography seem especially relevant, and with towards AGI and other things. And if you advance sufficiently far on that, then you get advantages in all of these other areas, which will be much less than you have in the ivory tower fields. But then you deploy them and have a slower effect on those lines, but still very fast from a outside perspective.
But you expect similar like political turmoil within the whole brain emulation?
Yeah, so that's the question. How confident can we be that whole brain emulation and whatever follows from that in this very, very rapid sequence is going to be much, 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 much more stable than things have been historically. And I think it very well could be much more stable. There are conceivable ways in which that could go. But from the perspective of a decision maker who's deciding, well, do I really want to rush this forward for a possibility of slightly greater profit? Then it's their uncertainty over, will it be much safer or will it be something vaguely contiguous with historical rates and subjective time?
It seems to me that one of the dangerous things we could do would be to try to solve the control problem. Because in terms of the kind of political narrative of the emulations themselves, having been born out of this situation where a bunch of Neanderthals tried to control and limit their capabilities, might be exactly the kind of thing that would make them less friendly stewards of the remaining 10, 20 billion humans on the planet, whatever the number is. And so potentially there's a version of the control problem which is just, let's not try to solve it, but let's think really carefully about which brains we emulate first, and like, who the first 10 or 20 people we send through this transition are, what personality types we want in order to have a friendly society on the other side. How much have you thought about those two things as a
Yeah, so the selection of initial candidates is the thing you strongly want to do. And so from a personal perspective, I'm really pro with the upload rates. Indeed, so if with an option and didn't involve being copied en masse briefly and then wiped out as some slightly more efficient version appeared on the market, it would be something I might want to embrace. But you can adopt the perspective of emulations are people too, and even going forward, we'd like even many or most humans to be able to upload and move into this position, and yet also want to create some kind of very stable order that will be able to maintain that initial commitment of those first uploads going in, who maybe don't want to have this radical transformation into the full reaches of the competitive scenario, but whether they're able to hold that together over time in the face of competition depends on their initial conditions. So if you were having a project like that, I would imagine you would want to find volunteers who are very keen on the long-term prospects you can get after you've stabilized the situation, which then allows for, say, a more equal distribution of the right to be uploaded, allows for a more sustained, even distribution of wealth across uploads, non-uploaded humans, and new AGIs and other kinds of beings that come into existence. And so to the extent that you can separate that, that would be the way to do it. But there's a question of, with people working on such a project, brain emulations working on such a project, of developing better control measures, perhaps including novel forms of AGI, better forms of mind reading and loyalty verification. Would they see that as, look, we're working under very harsh conditions, as we accepted in order to achieve this important thing and help the rest of humanity and ourselves going forward, or have we been like drafted into this project by people who don't care about us? And this is perhaps the disadvantage of rushing over ethics. But yeah, so so I would endorse all of these solutions. So make sure that you have only volunteers who have philosophical views that are compatible with this. Make sure that they have credible expectations that they will be greatly rewarded going forward. Their rights will be respected. Do everything you can to make things congenial to them, and sort of valorize and honor them because they're saving your butt. Would be
Hello there, I'm LaLaScrub. I would like to criticize the presentation a little, if you wouldn't mind.
Not too long, if possible.
No. Sure, just a question. Well, you seem to be thinking or suggesting that it's a bad thing that the human elites are going to be retired. Well, personally, I don't think that's a bad thing at all.
I'd just like to disclaim that I'm not very attached to the position of power of the Politburo. I do think it's something that, if one is thinking descriptively about what's likely to happen.
Well, Politburo or the White House, I'm not fond of either. Anyway, and also as somebody who is, well, very wary of dangerous ideologies, you seem to be suggesting a very unhealthy mixture of human exceptionalism, which I interpret as a kind of racism, and, well, totalitarianism, some kind of obsession with controlling every kind of AI out there, and totally free, unregulated capitalism, which I also interpreted as highly unethical. So, well, instead of these, why aren't you working on thinking of what kind of social, political changes would be more acceptable for both mankind and machine kind without, this seems, well, this slide presently disregards the rights of our mind's children entirely, I think. Why this approach? Because, Dr. Strangelove would have loved your plan, but he's not a very reasonable person, well, in fiction. But this is not science fiction. I don't want a dystopia. Why do you want a totalitarian world? I don't understand it.
I think I'll just disclaim endorsement of unregulated capitalism, totalitarianism, or differential moral status for whole brain emulations and humans.
I wonder if you, so what's your bottom line in terms of probabilities? You would assign, say, A, conditional on whole brain emulations being the first form of machine intelligence to arrive, that the initial creation of this will be under the control of one agency, whether it's one state or one research group, rather than sort of simultaneously merging in many places. That's one. And B, the probability that if there is this one group that controls the launch of the whole brain emulation era, that they will be able to get an outcome at the end of it that avoids an existential catastrophe. Or that avoids a kind of hyper-competitive market scenario of the type that Robin outlines.
So I'd say we should have very wide confidence intervals on these in general. So the kind of anticipation involved in foreseeing such things, having an organized effort to create the technology, that won't necessarily happen if things are coming out of a scientific project that just starts to work better, faster, relatively suddenly. Not going to happen too much if things develop in an open source fashion in the scientific literature and so on. Then again, you don't have much desynchronization. So I'd say that there's a sizable chance that you wind up with one agency, more than a quarter, but less than 3/4 would be my assignment there. And going forward, do you avoid the hyper-competitive evolutionary outcome given an initial starting point of a single global governance mechanism? My guess would be that first that any additional safety measures that one is adding on here don't necessarily have that much marginal effect beyond just the starting point. If you have people, the whole brain emulations, who have plenty of time to work on things, and given that people in general want to avoid outcomes that they see as horrendous, given with lots of time, smarts, and resources. I would not bet on severe systematic error or screw-ups. Just because, I mean, if you have a very predictable error, then there's the question of why are all of these agents unable to predict it, given all the other evidence that they have.
Okay, I'm going to have to cut off the questions there, unfortunately. And so join us at 6 for the final keynote of the conferences. And just give a thanks to Carl.